So I'm going to try to read a book, whispering. Unfortunately, all I could find was one of my son's books, The Quest for the Diamond Sword. It looks like it is like a Minecraft type book. Whatever works, right? Excuse me. Life on the farm. Steve wasn't a risk taker. He lived a simple life on a flourishing wheat farm where he grew carrots, potatoes, and pumpkins. He also bred pigs. Afternoons were spent talking to Elliot, the blacksmith, or Avery, the librarian, who lived in the nearby village. In the village, he'd trade wheat and coal for emeralds. He used the emeralds to adorn the walls of his home. Yet that morning, he decided to head to town and exchange some of his emeralds for iron. Steve wanted to craft an iron armor. Although he never planned on using it, he was curious and knew it was important to have armor. He also liked crafting things. Elliot was in his shop when Steve arrived and said, "Hi, Steve, looking for more emeralds?" "No." Steve took out his emeralds. "I have too many. I'd like to exchange them for iron ingots." "What are you going to do with iron?" Elliot asked. "Are you going to build another golem? You were so nice to build that for our village." "Thanks, but I want to craft armor," replied Steve. "Are you going on an adventure?" Elliot couldn't believe his ears. Steve was the last person he'd expect to want armor or go on any adventure. "I hope not," Steve smiled. "I just thought it would be good to have armor in my inventory." "Enjoy crafting, Steve." Elliot gave him the iron ingots. On the way home, Steve ran into Avery, the librarian, who said, "You should come by the library, Steve. We have lots of new books." "I can't today," he told her. "I'm crafting armor." "How exciting!" exclaimed Avery. "Are you planning an adventure?" "You know me," Steve remarked. "I like to stay out of trouble and stick close to home." Sometimes people don't plan adventures, they just happen. Avery had read every adventure tale in the library. She loved those stories. "That's true." Steve smiled at Avery. "But I'd rather just keep the armor in my inventory and read about adventures." Steve crafted his iron armor. He tried it on and walked around his house. "I must look like a warrior," he said to himself as he put the armor away and took a short walk before dusk. Steve would never venture out at night. He knew that is when the creepers would attack him. His farm wasn't far from the water, and he walked over and looked out at the enormous blue ocean as he wondered what lands might be on the other side. He had never hopped on a boat to find out. If Steve had an adventure story to tell, it would be about the time he once tamed an ocelot. Lost in the vast, unexplored jungle, surrounded by bushes deep in the jungle biome, Steve spotted an animal racing past toward an overgrown patch of grass and weeds. As the animal's pace slowed, he could make out its yellow fur covered in black and brownish spots. It was a wild ocelot. The ocelot's piercing green eyes stared menacingly at Steve. Steve's heart skipped a beat. He wanted to tame this wild beast. He offered the feline raw fish, which the hungry ocelot eagerly accepted. With each bite, the ocelot transformed into a tame animal. Slowly, resembled a typical tabby cat. The ocelot's tail shrunk, signifying it was no longer feral. Steve named the ocelot Snuggles. He'd be the first to admit he felt safer on the farm with Snuggles. As everyone knows, ocelots scare off creepers. Steve was afraid of creepers. Steve knew that if you were careful, you could avoid running into creepers, skeletons, spiders, silverfish, zombies, and other hostile mobs whose sole purpose was to attack. In fact, Steve had helped secure the village from a zombie attack. He built a fence all the way around the village and placed torches along the main street so all the land inside the wall was brightly lit, day and night. This way, he could be sure that zombies wouldn't spawn in his village. As Elliot the blacksmith mentioned, Steve had also built an iron golem to protect them. He placed iron blocks and a pumpkin on the ground and watched as the tough, mighty beast got onto its feet. As Steve watched the monstrous stone creature lumber toward the village, he was sure it would be able to keep him and his villager friends safe from zombies and other mobs. When he wasn't protecting his home from predators, Steve spent his time making coal out of wood. He traded the coal with Elliot the blacksmith for pickaxes, which he used for mining. He also traded his wheat for cookies from John the village farmer. When he mined for gold, he usually traded it for books with Avery, the librarian. Between the villagers and the farm, he had all his needs provided for and a safe place to sleep every night. He loved coming back to the farm and hearing Snuggles meow at the ocelot relaxed in the greenery. When night began to fall, Steve immediately got into his wool bed. Nighttime was the most vulnerable time. As the sun sank into the sky, the shadows grew and the well-lit areas became darker until Steve's village was the only bright place, bright enough that the mobs wouldn't spawn there. But outside the walls, he could always hear the zombies groaning and the strange, scaring sounds of spiders. If you weren't in your bed when night fell, you were pretty much an open target. A well-built bed would keep you safe until daybreak. When dusk approached, Steve was always safely in his bed at the farm. Once Steve saw a tall, dark Enderman with a purple aura when he was out at dusk, but he knew not to stare. He safely made his escape and learned his lesson. When the lights began to dim, it was time to go home. There was no reason to take any chances. But that night, as Steve slept in the comfort of his bed, he heard strange noises coming from the village. The villagers were in trouble, and as Steve listened to the groans and the sound of wood breaking, he knew it could only be one thing: a zombie attack. He tried to convince himself that he was just hearing things and that they were fine, but the noises would not stop. He imagined going into town and seeing the villagers turned all into zombies, and he grabbed his clock to see how much time he had before morning. It was still so early. Steve clutched his clock tightly, wondering if he could wait till morning. But as he felt the clock tick in his hands and heard the villagers' cries, Steve knew he had to help right away. Since Ellie knew that Steve had the armor, he was probably waiting helplessly for Steve to attack the zombies. The other villagers were also Steve's good friends. He liked villagers better than other explorers like him because they couldn't be griefers and wouldn't harm him. growing their crops and making useful things to trade. They followed predictable routines and never strayed far from home. But they helped one another and never caused any havoc in his life. Grievers were wanderers who spent their time playing pranks on other explorers and generally making all sorts of trouble. They intentionally did bad things to other people to steal more stuff for themselves. There were some grievers who just picked on folks because they thought it would be fun and they liked tricking people. They'd use TNT to destroy a house or lie and say they needed help and then attack. Steve didn't want to lose his house or his stuff to any grievers, so he was careful not to trust anyone but his villager friends. And now zombies were attacking them. Steve had to help. He tried to convince himself that the iron golem could handle the zombies, but the desperate cries from the villagers meant the golem wasn't powerful enough to defeat zombies by itself. Or even worse, something had happened to the stone creature. Steve thought of Avery and the books he had gotten from her. He could imagine a zombie overpowering her as she raced through the streets in her flowing white robe. He wondered if the zombies were destroying John the farmer's crops. He imagined Elliot tried to hide in his blacksmith shop from the vicious monsters. The cries grew louder and the images of his friends being attacked by zombies swirled around his panicked mind. Steve knew he had to help them. If he didn't do something heroic soon, he would be a no-good coward who let the village get destroyed. Although it defied all of his instincts to avoid danger, Steve threw off the covers and got out of bed. He checked the room for spiders and creepers. Then he went to his chest to get ready. For the first time, he suited up in all the armor that he made, which he loved having but never ever thought he'd actually use. Luckily, Steve had a well-stocked inventory since he never battled, just collected armor and swords and other tools to protect him. He took out his compass, iron sword, bow, and arrows from his inventory. Then he paused, grabbed his special gold sword just in case he needed it. His hand shook. His heart raced. He was scared. In that moment, Steve had always feared, and now he's living it. It was that moment Steve always feared, and now he's living it. That was chapter 1. That's all I'm